Party. Mandatory. Redistribution Party. Mandatory. Redistribution Party.
Ahoy, and welcome to Mandatory Redistribution Party. Today's episode is an interview with Wendy Liu, software developer, writer, and author of Abolish Silicon Valley, a disillusionment memoir about crashing out of the ideology of big tech. Against the backdrop of atomizing everyone into the gig economy, hoovering up some of the biggest profits the globe has to offer, and enshrining a reliance on technology during a climate crisis, how does the ideology of Silicon Valley insulate and sustain itself despite serious mounting criticism? But before we can take these questions, first I want to thank all of our investors on patreon.com who took a chance on a plucky team working to design a new kind of MP3 file that contains light-hearted radical left lore. We have not found a market yet, and we may never turn a profit. If you want to get in on our IPO on the ground floor, simply head to patreon.com/mandatory redistribution party to see your stock options. As ever, thanks to our supporters and to those who use smiling emojis when sharing our content around the internet's gleaming tubes. Thank you, and welcome to the episode. So first I want to say, I really enjoyed the book.
Oh, thanks so much for reading it.
Would you be able to just give people who aren't familiar with it just a very big picture overview of what to expect?
Sure, yeah. And first of all, thanks for inviting me on the show. Really happy to be here. So the book, Abolish Silicon Valley, I mean, the title is a bit tongue-in-cheek. It's a memoir. It's like a theoretical memoir is how my publisher describes it. And the goal of the book is to appeal to people who don't know anything about the industry or maybe, thinking of joining the industry but aren't quite there yet, and also people who are already in it. And it's trying to describe it in a way that is critical, but still accessible, and also in a way that can be understood by people who are in it and who, have heard a lot of the critiques of the industry and just don't believe them. So I wanted to try to do something a little bit different, which is partly why I wanted to do an autobiographical story, because I wanted to write about my own experiences and my own disillusionment with the industry, and hopefully through that personal narrative, give the reader something to latch onto, so something that would, help them understand why I advocate now for the abolition of Silicon Valley. So yeah, the book came out last year with Repeater Books, and the general premise of the book is that there is this thing that we call Silicon Valley, but it's not something we can think of in isolation. It's not this, magical thing that came out of nowhere and that's going to fix our problems. It is an outgrowth of capitalism. It is, a particular industry that has formed around a certain set of developments in the mode of production and has come up with all of these myths, all of these self-justifications, all of these cultural artifacts that make it seem like it's something different, that make it seem like it's something shiny and new, but it's really not. And when I'm talking about, the abolition of Silicon Valley, what I'm really trying to say is that we can try to imagine a world where Silicon Valley wouldn't exist and where we have no need for Silicon Valley because we have a different way of incentivizing innovation. We have a different way of distributing wealth, and that it's not going to be an easy thing. I mean, there's, for example, the prison abolition movement, no one is saying that it would be easy, but the whole point is that it's worth having a kind of horizon to think about, a horizon that helps us understand alternative ways of organizing society. And so I think, the call to abolish Silicon Valley, it's not just to say we need to swap out Mark Zuckerberg with a woman or a slightly nicer person or whatever. It's about saying, this whole thing is resting on this horrible foundation, capitalism, and, we want to try to build a system, build a world where we don't need people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg to roll over all of us in exchange for delivering what they call innovation.
And you mentioned a lot about the myth-making and the self-justifications. It seems like a book about an ideology, how there's like a superstructure that maintains a global myth of a technocratic future. Was that your aim, to focus more on the ideas that uphold Silicon Valley?
Yeah, that's a great question. That is definitely what I was going for with the book. And I think part of the reason I wanted to focus on the ideology, I wanted to focus on the kind of personal elements and how it feels to be inside the structure, is because I think there just hasn't been enough discussion of that and how that contributes to why there's such a bubble. Here's the thing, like, if you tell anyone inside the industry, if you talk to someone who's really wealthy and who's really successful, and you tell them the critiques of the industry, you can just like watch the expression on their face be like, oh, I don't care, right? And not everyone, but most people who are in these positions, they've adopted this shield, this ideological shield, so that they don't have to think about the harm that not only their industry, but this whole system is doing to everybody else on the planet. And I think that's fascinating because I think there is a reason those shields get erected. It's partly material circumstances, but it's also partly there's something psychological where, and this is what I was trying to explore with the first chapter, the first section of my book, where I talk about my childhood and how I basically sought refuge in computers because I didn't really have much else going on for me. And I think that is something that is pretty common for a certain type of person in tech who is attracted to the industry precisely because it gives them an escape. It gives them a way to feel valuable. It gives them a way to feel like they're part of something that they weren't able to get elsewhere for whatever reason. And the problem with that is that, that's a good thing. Sure, it's nice to find a community. It's nice to feel like your skills are valuable. It's not great when that community catapults you in this position of power over other people, and then you feel like you can justify anything you do because it's like, oh yeah, I was bullied as a kid, or I didn't have any friends. I grew up poor or whatever. And I think this is symptomatic of a deeper problem within capitalism, where you have, because there's so little. There's so little community that you can really find. Everybody is being increasingly atomized, and also at the same time you have this massive income inequality. There is a kind of narrative that people who are able to transcend the income divide, or who are able to, find a community or find some success, they're able to tell themselves that they deserve it, that because they grew up in a way that was, somewhat suboptimal, they're able to say, well, okay, well, sure, now I'm making $20 million a year and my lifestyle is directly contributing to something I think is bad, or, I'm working for a company that I know is harmful, but still, I earned it, right? And I wanted to explore that. I wanted to talk about how this kind of self-delusion sets in and why it's so difficult to dislodge, because this is something I'm very intimately familiar with. And the process of writing this book was in some ways very uncomfortable because I had to confront my own self-delusions. I had to think about the ways in which I lied to myself and tried to make myself feel better about Silicon Valley, about capitalism, about my place in the world. It was not a fun book to write, definitely. I would say like the first few chapters, I really struggled with those, and I wasn't even sure, like, is this a good idea? Am I going to regret writing this? Because I'm working out some weird personal stuff in the process of writing this book. Maybe everyone's going to hate it. So yeah, but I do think that part of the project I'm going for with this book is talking about not just the cold hard facts, not just, like, here's the product this company makes and here's the harm it has. I want to talk about why people can be very aware of the critiques and just find a way to ignore them. Because I think that is true of a large part of the industry. Because we all know the critiques now, right? The media is talking about tech all of the time. There's always something about how big tech is harming us. If people don't see a place for themselves in the critiques, if they don't see a way that they could participate in an alternative, then they're just going to reject all the critiques. And that means not just this kind of standard liberal media, big tech is destroying democracy critique. I also mean, the larger critiques of tech as an agent of capital, as something that really just enhances exploitation, that allows a few billionaires to accumulate tons of wealth while their workers are, sleeping in cars. I think those critiques will also get lost if the people in the industry and people in positions of power don't understand, how they're implicated in them, and just kind of they find a way to absolve themselves of the guilt or the anger that they should feel about it because they've chosen to identify with a more individualistic vision where they're thinking like, well, I am just this Ubermensch. I have just accomplished so much. I am this amazing developer or manager or a venture capitalist, whatever. And all the critiques that all these people are coming at me with, well, they're just jealous. I think that is, unfortunately, a pretty common strain in the industry. And I'm under no illusions that my book will be read by these people. I think the audience is not going to be, the wealthy venture capitalists. It's more, I would say, people who are either not in tech or who are maybe newer to tech. I've had some conversations with people who are students, who are maybe, a couple years out of college and who are thinking about joining tech. And I think my hope is to get to those people, the people who are going to be the future of the industry, and have them understand how deeply corrupt it is. And in the hopes that they will make different choices or just think about things differently.
Because so much seems grounded in such young formative experiences. People are being recruited into these huge corporations like when they're 20. There must be a reason why they'd rather have someone that's not gone out and gained a decade of life experience. They want someone who's kind of a bit of a tabula rasa to be like, we're Google, we're your friends. Now sign up here for your life.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ageism in the industry too, right? And like when I was really excited about tech, I saw that as a good thing. I was like, oh, well, I'm young, so I want people to, hire more young people. I don't really care about the 40-year-olds who are just unable to find a job because everyone sees them as too old. But, now I'm getting older and I'm seeing my friends kind of think about this too. There is a strong current of ageism that has to do with a bunch of things, weird stereotypes about how old people just like can't learn as quickly. Mark Zuckerberg had this weird line about that, but also just a very kind of cold, calculating decision about people's ability to be overexploited, right? Because if you're 20 and you're fresh out of school, you're eager to prove yourself, you are going to work really, really hard if you think you're being given that chance, right? And you probably don't have attachments, you don't necessarily have kids or a family, you can just work 100-hour weeks, no problem, in exchange for the possibility of moving up the career ladder. If you're 40 and you have a family, especially, if you're a woman, and there's a recognition that you have childcare or domestic responsibilities, it's a lot harder to get you to work 100-hour weeks. And yeah, I think, you're spot on. There's something really sinister about these companies deliberately recruiting these very, very young kids, really straight out of school, who don't really have much cynicism, who aren't necessarily conditioned to be skeptical of corporations, and telling them, this is your family now. Just be loyal to us, and then we'll reward you with all of the money, all of the stock, all of the massages and ping pong tables your heart could possibly desire. And I think, yeah, that is something that hopefully people will be more skeptical about, but these companies have managed to build a pretty loyal workforce, at least among, the employees that they're treating well, simply by getting kids right out of college and just giving them the opportunity to advance and making it into kind of a calling, not just a job, but, a mission. Like, we're all in it together. We're going to change the world. There's something really sinister in that. And I think it doesn't work that well on people who are older and more skeptical of life.
So obviously, by the time you got to university, you were already choosing to do a degree in tech. You already knew what your interests were. And I found it really interesting you mentioned doing not prom as a teenager, because I remember, I think we must have been like of the same generation of, indoor, friendless online teenagers. We did an episode recently, like very nostalgic, about what the internet used to be like in that specific early 2000s era, before it had been like primitively accumulated and there's only like 7 websites. As much as it was like, the World Wide Web full of information, it was politically, I don't remember any politics on there beyond George Bush memes and new atheism. But now on Twitter, you can find 15-year-olds posting about Adorno. Do you think something's actually like changed for the younger generation, that what we thought as our like nostalgic bulletin board haven was actually just kind of libertarian techno hell?
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear that you also knew Not Prawn. I've never talked to anyone who's read my book who has also experienced Not Prawn. Yeah, I mean, it's the internet back then. It was a simpler place. It was there was a lot more, I would say, like just weird parts of it that I think in hindsight were really bad for young people to be on. But I didn't know. I mean, I did spend a lot of time on 4chan. Just thinking like, oh, this is just funny. Like, this is just what humor should be, not recognizing how pretty messed up a lot of it was. But yeah, I think it does seem like something has changed. And, the resurgence of the left in the last few years, I mean, hearing people who have been on the left for a while talk about it, I get a little misty-eyed because, it's the way they talk about it, it's like there was a desert, not just on the internet, but just everywhere, right? Like, you just didn't really have that many people who were receptive to that kind of messaging. And there wasn't much media representation. There didn't seem like there were that many spaces. There were, I don't know, a few leftist groups that clung around, and mostly through selling newspapers at rallies or whatever. But it didn't seem like there was that much hope. There was that much future. And it, the membership of the Democratic Socialists of America in the U.S., I believe the average age was like, I don't know, 50s or 60s. For a while until 2016 when all these people joined. And I think there is a marked difference in the way that the left is now, the size of it, the vibrancy of it compared to maybe several years ago. And I hope that's good. I do think that, I see some 15-year-olds on like Twitter or whatever, and they're so dogmatic in their beliefs about whatever it is. And I'm like, okay, you'll grow. you won't have this exact line your whole life. But no, I think it's amazing. And yeah, when I was on the internet, I think the only politics I was exposed to as a kid was just the open source movement. And the whole idea of electronic freedom and how software should not be patented. And for me, that was quite liberatory, and it was quite beautiful. And I still think it is. I just think that the problem is that I was never aware of the larger political ramifications. I just thought like, oh, yeah, copyright is bad. Sure. All right, great. That's it. It never occurred to me to think about how our entire socioeconomic system is founded on the idea of property. And that intellectual property is just like a new terrain for property law to extend that will allow corporations to amass more money. I was just like, oh yeah, open source is so obviously a good idea. I'm going to be really virtuous and only use open source software, right? This very individualistic, naive way of viewing the world. And yeah, if there was any political content that I found online, I guess it would be like Michael Moore stuff. I remember watching a Michael Moore documentary. There's a lot of like Michael Moore commentary. He seemed like the most radical left-wing person who was given, primetime air. So yeah, it's a very different place. And, now it is amazing that you can just go on Twitter and just talk to people. Like, you're kind of like, where did all these leftists come from, right? Like, where did all these people come from? And, for me, given that, it was really the last few years where I started thinking about politics at all. I guess the answer is just like, well, like look around us. Look at how awful this world has gotten. Of course, people are turning to leftist ideas because like they're broke. They're seeing climate change, threaten the future of this planet. They're seeing like 3 billionaires amass as much wealth as 50% of the population or whatever. And it's like, okay, yeah, the times are producing leftists. And yeah, the internet is changing.
And in a way, from your book, it sounds like that Silicon Valley is going some way to produce leftists via this incredible mechanism of getting people to do startups and play the lottery on their own future like that. To me, STEM always was, this is a sensible pipeline to a sensible job. But it seems that within tech, they've kind of convinced a generation of young people to be like, actually, why not play the lottery on this, have a much less secure life, much less secure income, much less secure sleep pattern, it sounds like.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm not sure why that is exactly. Like, why is there so much, interest in entrepreneurship? I guess you could connect it to just like the neoliberalization of everything, and everyone has to be an entrepreneur of the self, right? And it's, Silicon Valley isn't immune from that. I think on the other hand, though, it is worth mentioning that to be a startup founder is not actually that insecure. Right? Because like for the, while you're doing your startup, maybe you're not getting paid that well. Maybe you don't know if your company has a future. But as long as you're talking to the right people, as long as you have the right connections, you will be fine. Even if your startup fails, like my startup failed. And, in our last year, we had so many acquisition talks with people. And the only reason that we didn't get a better acquisition deal is because we were all, I was just like, I don't care anymore. I don't want to do this. If I don't want to work for another company in tech, because usually acquisition offers, so like, let's say your startup is failing and you don't want to do it anymore. It's pretty easy if you have the right investors, the right connections to just get a bigger company to acquire you, and then they'll give you a job. And it's basically like a signing bonus, right? Like whatever they pay to acquire your company, it's not going to be that much for them, but for you, it's going to be way more than you would have made if you had just walked through the door the normal way. And, my company, like we were surrounded by all these other companies that had been acqui-hired. And that's the kind of technical term, right? Like where the product didn't really work out. Maybe they didn't even have a product. Maybe they had co-founder issues. They had product market fit issues, whatever. It doesn't really matter because there are all these other companies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, just like all these companies that are just sitting on piles of cash and that are more than happy to pay a couple of million, maybe a little bit more to acquire some founders, like a team of people who've proven that they can execute. Because that is a hard thing in tech, right? To find a team of people who can actually work together and not kill each other and build something. Even if it's not something useful, the ability to build something is quite valued. And yeah, and I think like there was one of the numbers thrown around that was definitely an estimate, but still, it's not that far off. It's like if a company is paying $1 million per engineer through an acqui-hire, it's a good deal. Like that's pretty standard. So yeah, I mean, to your point about it being insecure, it is, but the reason that people choose to do it is maybe like, the 9-to-5 secured life just seems kind of boring, but also because they know that they'll probably be fine. Like if you went to the right schools, or if you are really good at hustling and reaching out to people, or you have some sort of connection to them, like if you know enough VCs, you will get a safe landing no matter what happens to your startup, basically. And you can see this in like all of these cases of people whose startups failed. Their startup fails because, their workers file a lawsuit against them and get their business shut down. Oh, they'll just become a partner at an accelerator. This is a true story. Their startup fails because their product is just pointless, and they'll be okay. They'll get like a partner gig. They'll be acqui-hired by another company. They'll be fine. I think for the people on top, for people who've demonstrated allegiance to capital, they will always have a soft landing, and they'll always have basically a golden parachute. And I think, that is part of the appeal of startups, right? Because you know that, and this is something that I talk about in my book. Like I knew that if this startup didn't work out, I could always just go get a job at Google, or we would be acqui-hired by a company similar to Google. It never really occurred to me that I was risking anything. And so I think that is quite different from the kind of entrepreneurialism that Silicon Valley companies love to advertise for their gig jobs, right? So like Uber and DoorDash, Deliveroo, all these like tech companies, they love to talk about how you can be your own boss and you can be an entrepreneur if you work for them, if you do deliveries for them or rideshare for them. And that's a very different kind of entrepreneurship than the kind that Travis Kalanick, the former CEO of Uber, is doing. Because with this kind of entrepreneurship, you have all of the risk, but you have none of the upside. If you're working for Uber as a rideshare driver and Uber IPOs, you're probably not going to get much stock. I think during the IPO, they gave out stock to such a tiny percentage of drivers and such a tiny amount of stock. And it was only to drivers who have worked for a very long time. So yeah, I mean, if your company does well, you're not going to benefit. But if the company doesn't do well, or if they decide to lower wages, then you are screwed. So yeah, I think it's worth thinking about how the concept of entrepreneurship is used in very different ways, depending on if it's for the startup founders or if it's for the people at the very bottom, the ones who are being exploited and who are ultimately generating all of the wealth that the startup founders are able to accrue.
Because there's just so much money floating around for people that can actually make stuff that there's just no actual material risk. Is that like the bottom line? Yeah,
I mean, it's tricky because there are people who are entrepreneurs and who have failed and, who have maybe lost money and who've maybe suffered as a result. There are people who have suffered severe depression as a result of being a founder. It can be kind of lonely. It can be kind of demoralizing. But at the same time, I think it is worth noting. I mean, it's really important to the Silicon Valley story that it is very clubby, and it's not about rewarding competence or like rewarding people who've built something useful. It's as much as it is creating an atmosphere where people can build things that investors are happy with. And that can mean, like if you just get on personally with an investor, they will find a job for you. They will find something for you. It doesn't matter what you're good at, right? Like there's this mystique about how you have to be technical to make it in Silicon Valley. A lot of the most wealthy people in tech don't even have technical skills, right? They have like history degrees or something. It's just that they've landed in this circle, maybe family connections, maybe they're really good at hustling, they did an MBA or something, they found a way to get into this industry and demonstrated enough loyalty to capital, because that's ultimately what it is a matter of. They might not think of it that way, but that's what they're doing. That, when they're picking investments, when they're trying to build products, they're really thinking about how do I help my limited partners get a return at the end of the day, even if they don't want it. They want to think about it in terms of, I'm creating a moonshot, right? Like I'm innovating, I'm democratizing finance, or I'm connecting the masses or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's all about like what's going to make money, because those are the structures. Those are the very material incentives that they have to be following.
You mentioned showing loyalty to capital, and I think one of the strengths of the ideology that's trying to pull people in is that there's a whole spectrum from I genuinely believe this can do good in the world, all the way to this will just make me rich. And that's quite a wide net to start pulling people in. And I'm sure most people fall somewhere in the middle of the bell curve. Is it ever talked about that making an absolute ton of money and helping the world might ever be in some kind of conflict or friction?
Great question. Yeah, I think in recent years, there has been more tech critique, but it's usually not coming from inside the house, right? It's not coming from the Bill Gates of the world. It's coming from scholars, it's coming from reporters, activists who are critical of the industry, but whose voices are not likely to be amplified by, the tech press. They're not likely to be celebrated by the powerful players in tech. And I think that there is a very strong strain within the industry that really believes that you can make a lot of money while making the world a better place. And in fact, the two are almost synonymous, or like very, very deeply entwined, in that if you're making a lot of money, it's probably because you've made the world a better place. And if you've made the world a better place, then of course you're going to make a lot of money. That's just the laws of economics. Because, it means if you make a lot of money, it's because people have had their lives dramatically benefited by your product. Of course, how could you question that? What a weird concept that that's not true. And I think that unfortunately is taken as gospel in some circles. And, to your point about the spectrum, I think that's a great way of thinking about it. I do think that in a way, like in my head, it's not so much a spectrum as it is, you just have like these two beliefs that are just entwined. And I think people find it very hard to believe one without the other. Mm. And so, right, because if you've made a lot of money, then you kind of have to believe that you're doing good for the world. Otherwise, what are you doing? Otherwise, you've wasted your life. Otherwise, you've spent your whole life chasing this futile, nihilistic goal. And I think that's really hard for people to think about. And I think, in a way, I'm really grateful that my startup failed and we sold for essentially nothing, because I think there's an alternate world where I would have made a lot more money, and I would have found a way to ascend the ranks of Silicon Valley, and then I would have become a very different person. Because I think having this much money, having money handed to you in a way that is wrapped in this myth of meritocracy, I think that completely rots your brain. I think it makes it very hard for you to see clearly. Being too close to power, being able to believe that you've achieved something amazing simply because you're just an amazing person, I think that really breaks you, and it makes you unable to see the world as it really is. And I think, unfortunately, that is a problem afflicting a lot of people in the top tiers in the industry, where they really think that they're so smart, they really think that they're doing good for the world, but they're just unable to see beyond the bounds of their own ego, because this world has rewarded them so much, and it's given them positive press, it's given them money, it's given them their name in all these publications or whatever, and a lot of Twitter followers or whatever, and it tells them like, oh, you're so good at innovating, and we're so proud of you. Keep doing what you're doing. And I think it's really hard for them to see that there's an alternate perspective. The kind of left-wing critique which ties their accumulation of wealth with just the degradation of society, and I don't think they're. I think for a lot of people, it's too bound up in their self-identity. They can't question that. They can't question whether this whole system might be flawed, because if it is, then what happens to them, right? It's really hard to walk that back.
Like, the book's really useful because it is talking through, here is the ideology landscape that you live in. You can believe all this stuff when you're inside of it. I think it can be hard for people to think that Jeff Bezos is just completely naive. But it seems particularly like ironic with tech in particular, because these major social media platforms and the expansion of the internet is allowing people to come in contact with all kinds of inconvenient ideas. Like, it seems increasingly incredible that people manage to maintain their ignorance while they're also on these platforms, that Elon Musk can tweet Marx was a capitalist, he even wrote a book about it, and people can be in the replies and be like, oh, just so you know, mate, I think that might actually be 100% wrong. And somehow none of that permeates, that people are talking so strongly, and I think with genuine passion, about social good, but I don't think they've ever heard of the concept of surplus value or Marxist alienation or the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. I just think those ideas are completely alien. Is anything happening with the expansion of communications, and that these people still are on big platforms, that over time it becomes harder to avoid coming into contact with these inconvenient truths? Or is it that the gated walls of this community are up higher than ever because they do also control the internet?
That's a really interesting question. So I think that, I don't think that the fact that the internet is dominated by tech companies is necessarily going to shield the people in power from the critiques. I think it's more that they're just good at ignoring them, right? I mean, think about how many kind of pieces of information you come across every day that you ignore. I think we all do it, right? You see a QAnon conspiracy theory thing and you're like, oh, it's that thing again. And I'm sure that when these rich people see some leftists posting, I don't know, guillotine memes in the replies, they're just like, oh, those guillotine people again, so annoying.
Yeah, they're not shedding a solitary tear.
No, exactly. They're just like, oh, it's so annoying. These people are just terrible. I'm sure that they tell themselves that. And I think what is interesting about the internet and maybe orthogonal to that, this rising tech worker consciousness that we're seeing in the industry at all these different companies, where you have people who are, working as maybe engineers, designers, product managers, or frontline workers in the case of companies like Uber and Amazon, who are doing something different. They're turning to a different kind of political ideology, and some of them are trying to unionize. Some of them are trying to, create these petitions to do something like to not work with ICE, for example, or to not sell to the U.S. military, or not work with police departments, or just to not hire a particular person who has toxic views or something. And it's like there is a kind of political activism happening within the industry that a lot of these tech leaders can't ignore, because it's coming from inside the house. It's coming from their own workers. And the workers are ultimately their source of wealth, their source of power. And so they can't exactly ignore it. They have to at least pretend to pay lip service or find some other way of dealing with it. They can just fire all of the workers if they wanted. But so, yeah, I think, to your point, there is a strand of criticism that is definitely being heard, whether or not it's being actually heated or just being dismissed as the social justice activists, they're back again. I think it might be more of the latter, but it's definitely gotten to the point where because these people have leverage, because they're the ones who are generating the wealth for these companies, they do have a certain kind of leverage, and they can't be so easily dismissed. So even if the critiques aren't necessarily exactly being taken to heart by their bosses, at least they're being dealt with. They have to be acknowledged in some way, just because they are getting at the source of power. And I think that is hopefully going to happen more in the future, just because, with these people, with the Elon Musks and Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, change is not going to happen by being mean to them on Twitter. As much as I think that's really fun and I really enjoy seeing it, that's not, my theory of change does not include yelling at these people on Twitter. Maybe it's a tiny part of it. Maybe, sure. But I think ultimately, if there's going to be any change in behavior and how these people operate, there has to be a kind of threat to their actual levers of power. How do these people get their power from? Well, it's because they own corporations that make them a lot of money. And how do you stop these corporations from making money? Well, the labor movement is a pretty tried and true way of doing that. That has been, there have been a lot of successes with that in the past. And it is a little bit different today. The industry is filled with a lot of people who are bought into the ideology, but I do think that there is a lot of potential. And especially because there are workers at these companies who are not given the same kind of privileges. So we're seeing this kind of like caste system emerge at a lot of these tech companies where they will hire some people as full-time employees and pay them a lot of money and give them stock or stock options and, just treat them as if they're like part of the family. And then they'll hire other people as contractors who don't necessarily get the same benefits, who don't have stock, who are paid way less and who are just kind of treated like trash. And I think that is pretty natural in a sense that this is how capitalism has operated in many other industries. So it's not surprising that tech is doing this. But I do think that this has the potential to create a kind of rising class consciousness as people in these positions realize, wait, like I'm not benefiting from Google. Why are they allowed to claim that they treat their workers well when I'm not getting paid well? And also with the people who are colleagues of contractors and just, the people who recognize like, oh, my colleague is doing the same work as I am, but they're getting paid less. And, it's probably because I went to Stanford and they went to this other school. And so I think there is a potential for solidarity to be built despite the system. It's tough, right? Because the boss has a lot of tricks up their sleeve, including just ideology, the fact that they can just pay people more and have them not think about it too much. So it's going to be an uphill battle. But yeah, I do think that there is a lot of potential for the tech industry to change through workers in, different parts of the industry to kind of like band together and make demands that their bosses do something differently.
Something that's reassuring about the potential of the labour movement is, as much as Silicon Valley is kind of desperate to depersonalise all labour and hide workers away and automate what they can, or even just, I think a lot of what we think is automated is there's still someone in the back doing something. These places still need offices, they still need catering, they still need transport. You can never remove the functioning of the Silicon Valley away from hundreds of people that are working on all these tasks. Even before we start talking about the people that are actually designing the tech itself, it's probably a bit of a uphill journey to try and get solidarity between people on incredible pay packages and cleaning staff. But I think if that's the kind of solidarity you can make, then it stops the bosses being able to do anything. It's just traditional 20th century labor movement back again. Yeah, definitely. And I think, what you're saying about how Silicon Valley has been able to pretend that there's, no workers here. It's just magic. It's just the AI is doing everything. I mean, I think that is increasingly being unmasked, right? Like this myth, we're starting to realize that like that's obviously not true. When your Amazon package arrives at your door, it's because someone at some factory has put that in a box and someone else was able to drive it to your place. And I think there's been more conversation too about the very material work that goes into assembling devices in the first place, right? Like, where do the minerals come from? Which war-torn countries are they taken from the ground using probably child labor or some other form of like heavily exploited labor? How are these products being assembled? It's like, well, it's in factories where people are treated terribly and are exposed to chemicals. There's so many parts of the supply chain that are often forgotten or neglected when talking of Silicon Valley, because the way the tech press loves to talk about it, it's like, oh, look at these like 10 engineers in a room who've managed to produce something amazing. Good for them. Yeah, now they're all millionaires. Amazing. And it's like, well, what about all the other work that goes into producing this? That is just not counted. That is not treated as actual work because it's seen as invisible, it's seen as infrastructure. I think this is that is actually pretty fundamental to the story of Silicon Valley. If you think about like Apple and the fact that Apple's able to produce so much profit and therefore able to pay at least some of its employees a lot of money, like, well, not all employees are counted there, right? The people who are digging the minerals out of the ground, they're not Apple employees, and they will never be Apple employees. Their labor is just discarded. It's treated as invisible. And same for the people who are building the devices in the factories. They're not thought of as Apple employees, even though, of course, they're fundamental to making these products. And this is not a Silicon Valley invention. This is not new. This is something that corporations have been doing basically as soon as they could. And, since the 70s and the 80s, when we've had this globalized economy that is mediated partly by, these container ships, the fact that you have the technology to be able to send things really far away and to be able to ship in a way that's really, really efficient, well, it just made it a lot easier for companies to outsource parts of their supply chain. And then we're seeing companies like Nike that don't really own
they don't really make anything, right? They have a brand and they get other people to make it and take the risks. You have all these fast fashion companies that are, their products are all being made in the same place in like Bangladesh or Vietnam or whatever. And it's all they own is the brand that differentiates them. And I think it's, worth noting how what Silicon Valley is doing, it's really just riding on the coattails of changes in corporate structure in the last like 30, 40 years with the neoliberalization and the globalization of the economy. They're taking advantage of the fact that it is very common for companies based in the global north to just own a very small number of assets, like just intangible assets mostly, and to employ a small number of people. And then the rest of it, all the rest of the work gets done by contractors, subcontractors in another country where they're just paid a pittance. And, then the CEO is able to say like, oh, me and my like 100 employees, we produce billions of dollars in profit because we're just all such brilliant engineers or whatever. They're able to get away with this lie and pretend that like the all of the value is produced by these Stanford engineers or whatever. And it's like, that's not exactly true, but the narrative is very helpful for these people to justify their wealth. So that's why they stick with it.
I was only just thinking about it while you were talking, but I feel like there's a big parallel in overseas labour, which, as well as cutting costs, it's to make sure the labourers that if someone finds out, oh, these jeans I got were made in completely substandard living conditions, completely terrible quality of life wrapped up in what it took to have a worker make these, but they're on the other side of the globe. The app and gig economy paradigm allows the hiding of workers that are even in your own community. My partner left her phone in an Uber and we found out the Uber driver just lives just round the corner. Like, these are just the people in your community, but you can't talk to them. You just have to push like one of 3 buttons in an app. My mom's always used the same taxi firm her whole life, tips very generously. And when I asked her once, I'm saying, I think you're really over tipping on these taxi drivers. And she said, no, listen, next time I phone a cab, instantly there. Just instantly there. She knows all the drivers. That kind of community-based transactional economy, not possible through an app. You can just communicate in star ratings. 5 for acceptable, any less for I want you to get sacked for some reason.
No, definitely. And I think it's really interesting how these companies have all shifted the role of the manager onto the customer. And so, instead of workers having a manager who will maybe tell them like what they're doing wrong, what they're doing better, and make decisions about hiring and firing, it's instead shifted onto the customer and then just operationalized by an algorithm. And so, the algorithm will say like, oh, this person gave you like a 4-star rating, you're fired. And there's no way to contest that really, right? It's just like you have to call someone and then maybe this person is another contractor, the support person you're talking to, and it's just like a huge mess. And these companies have done a really good job in trying to destroy even like the most basic amount of solidarity between customer and worker. So it's like, they're hiding it and they're also trying to make it almost an adversarial thing. And like they're trying to make workers interchangeable so that maybe one day they can be replaced by robots, even though that's really not technically feasible. But they like to pretend it is. All these companies are like basically selling off their self-driving car divisions. By the way, I don't know if you saw that, which is pretty funny because they claimed for a while like the only way they can be profitable is if they get self-driving cars. And it's like, oh, interesting. So they're basically saying that they're never going to be profitable unless they can find a way to monopolize all of infrastructure and just like raise their fares or be able to pay workers less than reproduction wages. It's unclear what the path for profitability is for a lot of these gig companies, but they're continuing to make a lot of money. And
there's even still plenty of companies that, as far as I know, don't make any money but just dominate a huge space in our life. Relatedly, like I really like that when you're talking about what needs to be changed about Silicon Valley, is that it's got such a huge hold on our culture, be that our way of engaging just with art or just music, things we want to do in our pastimes, but also just the culture of talking to your friend, which obviously the importance of that's gone through the roof since we've all been staring at screens for over a year now. If everything has to be mediated by a platform, if our downtime's on Netflix and our uptime's on Zoom, someone in tech determines every aspect of my ability to have interpersonal relationships. Yeah, so I read Mark Fisher's work a few years ago, and Mark Fisher was one of the founders of Repeater Books, my publisher,
And it really just blew me away because I think he does such a good job of talking about culture and how culture is being increasingly hijacked by corporations. And he has this line about talking about sports stadiums, I think. And I think this was maybe an essay about the London Olympics or something like that. And he talks about how, sports stadiums, they're just emblazoned with the logos of corporations. And it, in a way, it gets us to think that like, there's no way of having sports, there's no way of having culture without corporations. And I think Silicon Valley is really just doing something very similar, where because we associate watching movies or TV with Netflix and Amazon Prime and whatever other streaming services there are, we associate talking to other people with Zoom like we're doing right now. We associate, music with Spotify or Pandora, and we associate getting a car with Uber. I mean, if you watch a contemporary TV show, you'll see the characters talk about Uber. They'll just drop it in the way, we might talk about Google or like Kleenex. It's become like a noun or a verb, like, oh, your Uber's arrived. And I think there's something really, really pernicious in that, because we're watching in real time a company turn from this kind of upstart that is obviously founded on exploiting workers and avoiding labor law. We're seeing it turn from something that is contestable to something that just becomes part of the infrastructure of daily life. Something that is just, part of the air we breathe. It's like, oh, you just call an Uber. That's what you do. And that is something that really concerns me and it worries me, because it means that, well, that's really hard to contest when it's become something so commonplace and something that feels just like in the background. Recently, the Biden White House announced that Uber and Lyft would be offering rides to vaccine centers. And I think that really just sent this bolt of dread through me, because once these companies get to the point where they're seen as like the natural choices for the government to partner with, well, what hope is there really to be able to challenge their dominance and to be able to imagine a world where there is no Uber, there is no Lyft. Instead, you have, better public transit and also people who are actually employed to drive people around. Like, why can't we have those things? And it's, maybe the answer is that the more that our world is dominated by these corporations with their very particular way of running services, the harder it becomes to imagine alternatives. But equally, the more imperative it becomes that we imagine alternatives, because this way isn't working. There are so many casualties of this kind of like app-mediated capitalist mode of delivering services. Obviously, Uber drivers, Deliveroo workers, anyone who has to work for these platforms, but also artists, people who are putting their music on Spotify and who are not getting paid very much, because the business model is just, it is predicated on extracting as much value from artists as possible and not paying them very well in return. I think there are so many cases like that where there are a lot of people who are very unhappy with the arrangement, but they just don't have the power to do anything better. And so for me, I think it's really important to think about how our interactions with other people are being mediated by these services in a way that makes us think that it is capital that we have to think for these services. So, hence the common right-wing talking point in response to leftists being like, well, how can you critique capitalism? You have an iPhone. It's like, yeah, I have an iPhone, which was built by workers. It was every person who was involved in touching it or thinking about this iPhone, it was done by workers. And these are workers who I feel solidarity with. And they're all being exploited. And, I want them to have better wages and working conditions. I want them to have more control over their lives, but that's not possible. I think it's worth holding on to this alternate viewpoint where we don't have to think capital for anything. Capital, what is it good at? It's a colonizing force. It's good at taking credit for things done by workers, often in substandard conditions. And instead, we should be remembering, who is the worker? Who are the people who have gotten me the services I want? Well, it's, this guy who lives around the corner who happens to drive an Uber on the side. It is this artist who makes music and puts it on Spotify and gets paid like $12 a month or whatever. And I think it's, worth focusing on the human and thinking about how these technological relations between people they're obscuring the very human relationships. Because we're thinking like, oh, this person is just, I only know this person because, they drive for Uber and we have like an Uber mediated relationship. It's like, well, no, this person is also a member of your community and you're all citizens of the same place and you're all part of this global human society. I don't know. I'm running out of words here, but yeah, I think it is worth trying to find the language for that sort of thing and not thinking of someone merely as just another partner in this app-mediated transaction, because I think that is the world that these companies want to build. And that's very scary to me because it's a world in which they have more and more power and they prevent us from being able to imagine any alternatives.
And you finish off the book by writing a bunch of demands, right? These are the demands for what it means to abolish or reform Silicon Valley. It's such an unenviable task because you've got this very difficult tightrope to walk. How difficult was it to try and pare that down into like discrete possibilities for reform and not just think, well, under capitalism, this probably just can't happen. We need a whole new economic system before we could even begin to get any of these people to cede any power?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so. The way I was trying to think about it is I tried to find like what are the things about the tech industry that I admire, that I still admire even today, and what are the things that are just incompatible with global human flourishing. And I think, the things that I admire is like, there is this technology that can be developed in a way that is useful. And there's also this kind of optimism that you find among some people that is laudable, even if they're kind of wrong, right? They think that harnessing technology in a certain way can improve people's lives. It can improve efficiency. It can make people happier. Yeah, there's some truth to that. The question is who gets to decide how that is done? And right now the answer is capital. The answer is, people who are being paid by others in order to get a return on the Saudi Arabian wealth fund, or I don't know, the Walton family fund, or some Yale University's endowment. It's like ultimately it is capital that steers, and that is the problem. And so in trying to write that chapter, I had to think, okay, well, what are the things about the tech industry that can be extricated from this capitalist milieu, and what are the things that are just, we just can't have them anymore. And so some of the things I propose are the very standard, like socialist or even just social democratic ones. Things like workers need more power. They need the ability to survive without having to sell their soul to Uber. They need, better public services, better housing, just, more ground to stand on so that they can say, I don't want to do this job. It's, not paying me well enough, or it's humiliating, or it's bad for the planet or something. I think that's a pretty common refrain. The other thing is, I think, it's about infrastructure, and it's about who owns our infrastructure. Because right now, as we just talked about, so much of our infrastructure, physical and digital, it's owned by these corporations. And, I think that is a key part of what I see as the problem with Silicon Valley, the fact that you have these commons, essentially, that are enclosed by these corporations that have just managed to get there because of a particular political, economic regime, and because they have this money that comes from whatever venture capitalists they've managed to convince. And that has given them the ability to monopolize key aspects of our communal existence. And the effects of that are things like, for example, every time you go on the internet, you just see ads everywhere. Your whole experience is surrounded by ads. It doesn't have to be that way, right? We don't have to live in a world where there are 8 billionaires who control as much wealth as 50% of everybody else. It doesn't have to be like that. But I think the way Silicon Valley is set up, because of its role within capitalism as kind of the driving engine of profit within capitalism, that is what we have. And so, yeah, in trying to write this chapter, I don't know if I necessarily, it's not like the final word on the subject. It was more just kind of sketches and just trying to say, if you wanted to think about a different world, here are some areas. But, my goal is mainly to say that we can have an economy that's based on something other than profit. That's based on something other than, allowing the accumulation of wealth in perpetuity. Yeah, I think for me, the end goal that I pose as the kind of counterpoint to Silicon Valley is a world where we have collective ownership of the means of production, whatever that means to anyone listening. And I think that is a possibility that is precluded by the way the industry is set up. Because right now, what we don't have we don't have any sort of collective ownership of anything. It's really just a few people who, went to the right schools or know the right people. They own a large proportion of the stock in these various companies, and they're billionaires as a result of monopolizing gateways and advertising, or just the internet, or finance, or whatever it is. And I think this is this is a world that I don't want to live in. And I think for the vast majority of people on this planet, there are so many better alternatives that could be imagined and that can be fought for. It's not going to be easy, but to me, it does feel like a worthy struggle.
Mandatory Redistribution Party was produced by Sean Morley and Jack Evans. Our title theme was made by Ella Jean. Thank you again to Wendy Liu, whose book, Abolish Silicon Valley, How to Liberate Technology from Capitalism, was published by Repeater Books, and you can find more info in the episode notes below. Thank you to our Patreon supporters and to those who give us kindly quote tweets on the regs. We know who you are, and you are an indispensable part of this operation. Thank you for listening. Stay safe, honk on, and log off.